Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, as America once again seeks racial justice, a former policewoman who fatally shot Daunte Wright in the U.S. state of Minnesota has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. Kim Potter resigned along with the head of her local police department in a suburb of Minneapolis on Tuesday. Ms. Potter said she mistook her handgun for a taser. There have, of course, been regular protests since the killing happened on Sunday, reigniting the Black Lives Matter movement. We'll speak with an African-American author and historian about the anger in the black community in a moment. And later, after so much controversy, allegations of brutality against protesters and a boycott of the polls by the opposition, election results in Chad are expected to give President Idris Deby, one of Africa's longest-serving leaders, a sixth term. But with Human Rights Watch describing a ruthless crackdown on key opponents and anti-government demonstrations met with savage force, how legitimate will the international community consider Mr. Deby's sixth term to be? We have analysis from a seasoned African affairs analyst coming up. Let's begin, though, with a story we've covered extensively here on Arise News, and a killing that's lit the fuse once again in the African-American community and sparked a wave of protests in America. It follows the fatal shooting of Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old black man, by a white policewoman, Kim Potter, in a suburb of the U.S. city of Minneapolis. Ms. Potter has resigned, saying she mistook her handgun for a taser. She's now been charged with second-degree manslaughter, a count that carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in the state of Minnesota and/or a fine of $20,000. But the reaction from many black activists has been swift and angry. They insist that a charge of second-degree manslaughter is not enough and that it should be murder.
As we stand here today, having heard the president, having heard the attorney general and others, we demand that people deal with the question of there are two levels of policing in this country, one for blacks and one for whites, and we want federal law to be passed and enforced.
If ever there was a time in America when the police should be on their greatest behavior, their best behavior, if ever there was a time when they should use their best standard of care, if ever there was a time when they should use their best discretion, if ever there was a time, Reverend Al, when they should be de-escalating on every situation, it should be now.
I want them to know that Daunte Wright's past has nothing to do with the present. It has nothing to do with what happened on that stop. She didn't know Daunte, and she knew nothing about Daunte.
Well, for his reaction to the latest shooting incident in Minneapolis and to help us assess the mood in the black American community, I'm joined now from Buffalo, New York, by the African-American author and historian Emmanuel Kulu. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kulu, for joining us. So Kim Potter now facing a charge of second-degree manslaughter. What do you make of that? Does it seem at the bare minimum appropriate for what you understand to be what happened in this case?
Absolutely not. I believe first-degree murder at this point. You cannot mistake pulling a trigger for a taser. It has happened before. There has been situations where other officers have mistaken their gun for a taser. This is a training issue. This is not an issue where that was a mistake that I believe. She wanted to use excessive force against a young man who many officers have been trained to believe that black men are a violent threat. This was a young man who was just being stopped in a traffic stop and lost his life. We've seen several times of white men being pulled over and even fighting the cops, and they make it home. We've seen white men who have done have shot up the church and have made it home safely. Even some have been taken to Burger King or McDonald's before they go to the prison. So what we're seeing is racism at its finest and white supremacy at its finest as well. So it's absolutely an atrocity to the Black community for her to be charged with second-degree manslaughter as if it was a mistake.
Well, I mean, the fact, of course, is that she hasn't been charged with first-degree murder. She has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. And, I mean, even that, from what I get from what you're saying, even that doesn't guarantee justice, does it? Given that a family have now lost their son and the community still stands recognizing that Black lives don't seem to matter as much as those of their white peers in America.
Exactly. What we have to deal with in the police force is police reform. And also, qualified immunity is one of the biggest problems that is hurting this reform from happening. How an officer can be tried completely different from an average everyday citizen. A police officer's position is to serve and protect the people, the citizens. And we're not seeing that when it comes to African Americans. In fact, we're seeing them continue to be modern lynchings continuing to happen right in the same very state that George Floyd was murdered. And as we speak right now, his trial continues with the case of Derek Chauvin. So we're continuing to see this. And as the brother mentioned, police should be on their best behavior, knowing the high tensions in Minnesota right now and all over the country. In fact, this has affected the entire world, what we saw happen to George Floyd, and now it's happening again. And I also need to note that this young man was a biracial Black man. His mother is Caucasian. So it's very, at this point, America has to wake up, because the amount of biracial families are growing in America. So this is going to affect all of the entire community, Black, white, or whatever you are in America. So at this point, something has to change with some sort of police reform.
It's very interesting what you say there, and I'm wondering, perhaps you could tell us a bit about the anger in the African American community. I mean, we've seen a bit of that on the streets in Minneapolis, but now that these charges have been framed against the policewoman, do you think that anger will dissipate?
I don't think it will. I think it's going to get worse until justice is served. I believe the Black community is infuriated. The Black community typically has been very forgiving in this matter for centuries now. When we've seen what happened to Emmanuel, we've seen what happened to George Floyd recently. These things are constantly happening to the Black community, and the Black community is just protesting against it. So I don't believe it's going to get out of control, but I do believe Blacks in America are tired. They are tired of injustice. So something has to change, or else we don't really know what can happen.
I suppose the issue here with this community anger that you're talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that while the community is continuing to reckon with the pain of the loss of the life of Daunte Wright, recognizing, of course, that his life is one that is highly valued, the systemic racism is really what we're seeing the community responding to in great cause, recognizing that this is one more case where the system is seen to be failing.
And exactly. This is a system that was set up to systematically oppress Black people, African Americans, off of African blood, sweat, and tears. Free labor that was forced on America for Black America for 400 years. So these are things that we're continuing to see happen. These are modern day lynchings happening here. And I'm not going to call it anything other than what it is. And at this point, there are many Black communities that are starting to speculate, is this a trend? Is this something that is set up to happen? Is it, what is the actual, where are we headed with this? So we've seen many lives lost. This isn't just a flat tire and we can just brush over it. This is a man's life was lost over a traffic stop. Okay, so, and this young man didn't make it home. The conversation that's happening with Black mothers around the world is, when my son leaves, will he return home? And now even Caucasian mothers or Caucasian fathers who may have a biracial child, they have to start having that discussion with their child about possibly making it home. So it's starting to become very, very scary in the Black community and outraged. And the demand for justice, the outcry for justice continues.
Well, absolutely. We're going to take a break in a moment, but I just want to point out that you're making some very interesting points there, and there is a sense still that officials are not showing, and I think you touched on that they're going to be taking things like this seriously, even though, of course, there is a trial taking place in Minneapolis, a world-publicized trial. There isn't the sense that drastic measures are being put in place to change things. And I even understand that in the city where this happened, up to 50 police officers, none of them are living in the city where they're policing. But stay with us. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the state of policing and racial justice in America. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Anyegolu, and back to that story out of the U.S. city of Minneapolis and Kim Potter, the white policewoman who shot to death a young Black man, Daunte Wright. Ms. Potter has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. She claims she thought she had a taser, not her gun, in her hand. But prosecutors say they intend to prove that Officer Potter abrogated her responsibility to protect the public when she used her firearm rather than her taser. She has, of course, now resigned, along with the head of her local police department in a suburb of Minneapolis. There have been regular protests since the killing of Daunte, who was pulled over for a minor traffic offense. His death has ignited national conversations about racial justice, policing, and the use of force in America. And the African-American author and historian Emmanuel Kulu is still with me from Buffalo, New York. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kulu, for staying with us. And we've heard from President Obama, who's released that emotional statement saying that policing needs to be reimagined in America. Your work involves trying to tackle institutional racism in the U.S. What do you think needs to be done to stop this happening? Because there appear to be too many conversations about it.
Well, what we have to do is, when officers they're being chosen to work in a community that they know nothing about. So I believe, starting with, they used to have a DARE program right here in Buffalo, New York, where the officers would come out and introduce themselves to the community that they would be serving. They would meet these community leaders and learn about the community that you're coming in. This should be a must before anyone comes into a community with the intent to serve. I think a lot of these police officers are coming with the intent to, quote unquote, save this community from itself. And that mentality is the wrong mentality to have. So I believe there needs to be an introduction. Police reform is necessary. Holding a police officer accountable for what you know. You're trained on the law, and you should be held to a higher standard on the law because you know the law even better than the citizens do. That being said, you should be held to a higher standard than the citizens when it comes to the crimes that you commit that are far worse than the citizens are committing, because you're trained on the actual law. So accountability. Police accountability has to come into play. Qualified immunity is one of the main problems with the justice system that is causing many officers to walk free after murdering in the blood of African-American men and women.
Well, I mean, for purposes of our international audience and for the benefit of people in different parts of the world who may not really understand a lot of this, why is it that America appears to devalue black people? What is it that has caused them to see black and brown people and others as not quite as human as whites?
Say it's due to miseducation of black history. As you know, I am a historian and I educate around the country about the importance of African history being taught in the curriculums. When people look at you as if you have no history or you're historyless or you've made no contribution to the human story, well, they tend to look at you as a people of very little value. And that's what we see has happened in the United States. And this is due to 400 years of transatlantic slave trade. This is also due to systematic oppression through the prison system that has marginalized African Americans. We can talk about the crack epidemic in the 80s, that the Three Strikes Law, all of these things have been put in place. So the Emancipation Proclamation was put in place to free black slaves. Technically, these other systems, institutionalized prisons, and as well as marginalism, as well as redlining, all of these things were put in place to still enslave African people one way or the other. So these are the things that are happening that we want the international world to hear about what's going on in the United States. But it's something that it continues to be a problem. And when Africans were brought to this country, keep this in mind, they were considered 3/5 of a human being. And that was even written into many laws as well. So these are things that has to be reformed and changed in order for there to be some sort of justice to be served.
And in terms of this specific issue of police reform, do you think it is possible for America to rework its policies to such an extent that the country will find equity? Is it possible to examine every policy in such a way as to determine whether it's going to close disparities or is it going to increase them?
I think it would ease them. I don't know if it will solve them completely. That remains to be seen. But it's definitely something worth exploring at this point because we haven't seen it get better. Within a year, we're here again and discussing the same issues with the people who are supposed to serve and protect. So the government definitely should take a look at this and come to community leaders and asking for suggestions. To see what can be done. There are many black movements that are extending their hand at this time to speak with government officials about this. So I believe it's a good start. Will it truly make a difference? That remains to be seen. It'll have to be done before I say anything on that. But I believe the time is now to start having the conversation. To make a fair pact, a contract with Black America.
Right. So, I mean, in the context of policing, such policies need to be clear about how you have police in place and structures in place that do not continue to contribute to these inequities that you've talked about. And I suppose a fundamental question to ask is whether the current system is helping Black Americans and making them feel more or less safe.
Absolutely not. Black mothers right now around the United States are terrified every time their son leaves the home. I mean, this is very sad at this point that people have believed for years that Black people were lying about their pain, that they were enduring, that these mothers were enduring, losing their children. I mean, it's always some excuse or reason why. Did Daunte help himself by somewhat resisting and jumping back in that car? Absolutely not. But he still could have went to prison or whatever could have happened to him, holding center, to preserve his life. Keep a high value on life should be the police department's first priority, preserving life. And what we've seen when dealing with Black men That is not the first priority. So some sort of police accountability has to happen in order for us to see the change that we're demanding right now.
So when you talk about that systemic racism that exists within the police force, would you say that it's the majority or the minority of police officers?
I would say it's the minority. I won't say it's all. Listen, law enforcement is necessary to keep the peace. You need law enforcement, but you need law enforcement accountability. It's necessary to have the accountability for the peacekeepers. You need to, if you know the law, you've been trained on the law, okay, you're more trained than the citizens. You should be held to a higher standard if you break the law, and especially taking the life of a citizen. Okay, so this is something that has to change. This is something that police commissioners around the U.S. are going to have to start holding them accountable. There are blue codes that are allowing other police officers that are forcing other police officers who are good officers to stay silent on this matter. And they don't want to speak out about it because they're in fear that they may lose their job and won't be able to provide for their families. And also trying to stay with that blue code.
Okay, Emmanuel Kulu, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I want to thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. Emmanuel Kulu is the African-American author and historian talking to me from Buffalo, New York. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including, after much controversy, allegations of brutality against protesters and a boycott of the polls by the opposition. Election results are due out in Chad. We have analysis. Stay with us.